to English. First of all, well, we Spanish people, we speak English very badly and with a lot of mistakes, but everybody, we have the same problem, so feel free to make mistakes and don't worry if you are not bilingual and fluent as me and all of us. Well, it's a real honor and pleasure to introduce Martin Brune in this activity. Well, we are the organization team, we are fans of his work, and I'm going to make a very brief introduction of 3 minutes, but I want to underline the intellectual leadership of this author. He has no 600 papers published, but each paper that Martin Brune published is a kind of guide, intellectual, conceptual guide for a lot of researchers. So I think following the discussion, the previous discussion, perhaps Brune is not a producer of big data, but intellectual author and with a good frame to think. He has, sorry for this technical problem, he has an evolutionary point of view, and every step in his work is founded in integrated point of view. In 2005 he published a decisive paper that it was Theory of Mind in Schizophrenia, in Schizophrenia Bulletin, and after this paper a lot of researchers published contributions in the field of social cognition. Now he has changed his focus from social cognition to metacognition, and I am very interested in this issue, that is the problem of metacognition in borderline personality. So he works in the University of Bochum, and he is professor of psychiatry and psychosomatic medicine, I think. He's also a neurologist, and he has an assistant activity. Also every morning he's attending patients, so he's not disconnected from the practice. So thank you very much for coming to Spain again, because it's the 3rd time that we invite you, and Martin Brune.
Thank you very much, Guillermo, for the very kind introduction and for inviting me. I'm just recognizing that I can't see you, so I'm coming to the front. That's possible with your... So I can see everyone. First, let me apologize that I'm not able to present in Spanish. My Spanish is very poor, so I can say buenos dias to you, but not much more. And also my English is far from being perfect, so but I will try to do my best to give you a couple of ideas about borderline personality disorder from the viewpoint of evolutionary theory. So, this is the aim of my talk. I would actually like to convince you that from an evolutionary point of view, psychiatric problems can be seen from a different angle. And in particular, I believe it's not simply an academic exercise to look at psychiatric symptoms from an evolutionary perspective, but sometimes it might be necessary to take this stance, eventually to improve treatment, because I think several aspects of psychopathological conditions are sometimes incomprehensible or bound to misinterpretation if not interpreted in an evolutionary framework. And I think borderline personality disorder could be a nice model disorder to illustrate how this may actually work. But let's first take the traditional medical point of view on borderline personality disorder. I think most of you are, at least if you're working as clinicians, are familiar with the main symptoms of borderline personality disorder. According to ICD-10 and DSM's criteria, people with borderline personality disorder have intense fears of being abandoned. Many have unstable, though very intense, relationships with rapid changes between idealization and derogation of significant others. Some have identity disorder. Many show impulsive behaviors with regard to monetary investment, but also sexual behavior, for example. As you know, many have recurrent suicidal ideation or try to commit suicide or present with parasuicidal behavior by cutting other self-injurious behaviors. And one of the key symptoms, of course, is emotional dysregulation or emotional instability, along with depressive-like symptoms, feelings of emptiness and so forth. But some patients, as you know, perhaps from clinical practice, can become very angry and can have aggressive outbursts. And in some situations, mainly in situations when patients are highly stressed, they can have paranoid ideation or dissociative symptoms. Okay, when you look at prevalence rates, you see that it's a very common disorder. Its prevalence in the general population is around 1 to 2%. In clinical populations, it's much more prevalent. Up to 15% have symptoms of borderline personality disorder. And there is a kind of debate whether the female to male ratio is really 3 to 4 on the side of female patients compared to male patients. But most people say that it's more prevalent in women than in men. As you know, the typical onset is during adolescence or early adulthood, and at least 2/3 of patients have experienced some sort of childhood neglect or abuse. Depression is very common. 80% of patients have a comorbid depression, at least in clinical samples. And the contribution of genetics is in this disorder quite inconclusive, so not clear which genes are involved in the condition and why. Now, when you look at neuroimaging studies, you see that several studies show that people with borderline personality disorder have volume reductions, for example, in the hippocampal formation. And this slide shows that if you look at children with childhood abuse, you see that these children have a reduction in orbitofrontal volume. So this is akin to the standard medical model. There is a deficit, and we need to find ways to treat the deficit and to improve well-being and psychological health of these patients. All right, now I would like to present you an alternative perspective that is largely based on evolutionary thinking. So it's a completely different approach, and I would like to invite you to, at least for a couple of minutes, to abandon your So just take a different look at the disorder. Alfonso Tuisi, who is an evolutionary psychiatrist in Rome, published a very interesting paper now 10 years ago, and this was entitled The Concept of Alternative Strategies, whereby I should say, this is very important, the term strategy does by no means refer to conscious decision making. So in this regard, a strategy is something that an individual chooses, but not necessarily on his or her conscious decision making. So it can also be within the subconscious. So this is very important. And Alfonso actually wrote about antisocial personality disorder, and I would like to quote a brief passage of the abstract, where he's saying, antisocial personality disorder could represent a high-risk strategy of social defection associated with resource acquisition and reproduction. Insecure attachment could represent an evolved psychological mechanism that used the quality of parental care received during childhood as a key for optimizing adult reproductive strategies. So this perspective suggests that what we deal with, subjective well-being and so forth, is not a goal, if you like, of evolutionary processes. So evolution concerns reproductive success, not necessarily subjective well-being. That's the difference, or one difference, between the evolutionary perspective and the classical medical perspective. So now let's try to translate this perspective to borderline personality disorder, because I think there are several similarities between antisocial personality disorder, which is commonly a male disorder, if you like, and borderline personality disorder, which has many similarities on the side of female patients. Okay, so now I would like to introduce the theory of life history. And interestingly, life history theory has also been applied to animal personality disorder. Animal personality, not disorder, animal personality. So that was a Freudian slip. All right, this is a relevant passage of the paper that I briefly showed. So, life history theory suggests that individuals adjust their risk-taking behavior to their residual reproductive value, that is, their expected future fitness. That is a very technical expression of what I would like to explore in more detail in a couple of minutes. So, for example, individuals with relatively high expectations should be relatively risk-averse, because they can expect to survive to realize those expectations. Okay? By the same token, individuals with relatively low expectations with regard to future resource availability should be relatively risk-prone, because they have little to lose. And this is something I believe is typical for several or perhaps many patients with borderline personality disorder. So their expectations with regard to future resource availability, emotional availability of significant others, and so forth, is reduced compared to the statistical mean, if you want. All right? Now, we know from animal research that, of course, species differ widely with regard to their reproductive strategies, if you like, reproductive patterns also. And traditionally, The two ends of reproductive patterns have been referred to as R-selective strategy or pattern and K-selective strategy. So, for example, if you look at the slide, you see on the left-hand side that most fish species are typical species that follow an R-selective pattern of reproduction. So many reproduce only once during their lifetime. Salmon, for example, classic example, they produce a large number of offspring, millions of eggs, but very few survive to adulthood. They don't care for their offspring, so there's very little or none parental care. As already said, death rates in infancy and childhood is very high. Most have a short individual lifespan. Bodies are usually small, and so forth. Competition between the adults is low, and there is high random environmental variation. Now look at the right-hand side. You see the picture, the blurred picture is one of my kids several years ago at the age of 3 and 9 months. Now they are 10 and 7, but parental investment is still high and will be continuing to be high at least for another 10 or 20 years. Right, so this is a totally different pattern of reproduction, and one may ask from an evolutionary point of view, what is the advantage to produce so few offspring, and why is it that we invest, in technical terms, so much in such a few offspring? And one of the answers is that the survival rate of the few offspring is very high compared to fish, for example, or maybe if you want to stay among the mammalian species, rabbits and sort of mice. These are typical R strategists, and now we as humans and other primates, elephants, whales are the K strategists. So this is also associated with very low death rates during infancy and childhood. Species that follow a K-selected strategy live very long lives, usually. They grow large bodies, but competition among adults for resources is comparably high in K-selected species compared to R-selected species. And finally, environmental variation is fairly low in most, or if not all, species that follow the K-selected pattern. Now the interesting thing is, and this is what the previous slide referred to, there is also inter-individual differences within a species with regard to reproductive patterns. And these differences with regard to reproductive patterns strongly depend on early environmental conditions, perhaps even prenatal environmental conditions. Now let's take a look at this graph. Imagine a world where resources are scarce, very few resources available. So you live in a harsh environment. What could be the consequence of that? It could be that in such families, now let's speak about our own species, about humans, it could be that this leads to a high amount of stress within families. And this could be connected, or actually research has shown that this is connected to harsh and rejecting, sometimes insensitive parenting styles. Sometimes father absence, so divorce and separation. of parents at an early developmental stage. What's following, according to attachment theory, is more often than not, at least, the development of an insecure attachment style. So, many people who experience harsh early environments during childhood develop a so-called mistrustful internal working model, suggesting that future resource availability is poor. Okay, so the early experiences coin, if you like, or imprint an individual to expect little from the environment in the future. And what could follow is an opportunistic interpersonal orientation. So better take everything you get now than delaying your reward until an unpredictable future. That's something that I believe is perhaps true for people with antisocial personality disorder, as Joyce has pointed out. It might be true for people with borderline personality disorder as well. So the difference to classic Bowlbian attachment theory here is that insecure attachment styles can have an adaptive value, biologically speaking, in terms of reproductive success. So it might be a good thing to have many sexual partners, to engage very early in sexual activity and so forth, because you cannot predict that your future is bright. Actually, your prediction is that your future is not bright. So, so the logic, biologically speaking, is reproduce early, don't invest much in your offspring, and that could also relate to the non-genetic transmission of borderline personality styles in families. So at least that's one idea. So interestingly, research has shown that humans who grow up according to this faster life history pattern mature earlier somatically. So they enter menarche earlier than their counterparts on the slower path of reproductive strategy. So puberty sets in earlier, on average. And as I said already, many assume earlier sexual activity, they lead short-term and unstable relationships, there is limited parental investment, and on average they have more offspring, which is, of course, not measurable in our times because we have so efficient birth control methods. So we cannot simply look at a sample of borderline patients and say, so they have 10 instead of 2 or 3 kids. This is impractical in our time. And the opposite pattern is a slow reproductive strategy. Again, please consider that the term strategy does not mean conscious decision making. So if there is a family with spousal harmony, father is present, it's much more likely that the family environment is more supportive, responsive, emotionally, positively affectionate, and so forth. And kids more often develop secure attachment, trusting internal working models, and reciprocally rewarding interpersonal orientation may follow. And these kids also mature later, sexually, with the consequence that they may invest, technically expressed, more in their own kids as compared to the individuals who assume a fast life history pattern. So this is the theory. Now let's go to data. So, in Auckland, a couple of years ago, we did a small study in people with borderline personality disorder, and we expected, based on the life history model, that patients with borderline personality disorder experience more often than control subjects that the pregnancy of their mother was unwanted, that they experience a history of emotional neglect or abuse more often than controls. This is very well known already, but not framed in this evolutionary perspective. They experience more often than controls parental rejection and lack of emotional warmth. They may accelerate sexual maturation and sexual activity. They experience more often than controls unstable intimate relationships, which is already well known, and they may take more risks, particularly sexual risks, than controls, based on their early aversive experiences. By the way, the last point I think is important because, as I said earlier, many with borderline personality disorder have a comorbid depression, and it's not straightforward that people with comorbid depression take a lot of risks. So that might be different to people with pure depression who usually are risk averse. So why is it that people have depression and at the same time take a lot of risks, especially sexual risks and others? This is not, I think, easily understood within the classical medical framework, but it's maybe more straightforward if you think of it in an evolutionary perspective. Okay, what we actually found is that there were large differences with regard to the experience of parental punishment from both sides, father and mother. So there was more punishment in the borderline group. There was less emotional warmth from both parents in the borderline group. There was no difference with regard to control and overprotection between the groups, which in part related to the fact that indeed in families with borderline personality or patients with borderline personality disorder, there was a marital disruption or divorce much more often than in the control group. So if there is no father, he cannot exert control and overprotection. That's why there is no difference. Now, borderline patients more often than controls reported that their mother's pregnancy was unwanted. There was, as I said already, much more often parental divorce. Childhood maltreatment was absent in the control group, close to 90% in the borderline group. Even sexual abuse was around 70% in the borderline group, 0 in the control group. And there was a non-significant difference with regard to age at first sexual intercourse, which could relate to the relatively low sample size of 50 patients. And maybe the study was simply underpowered for this question. First sexual experience is rated problematic. Huge differences between the groups. Number of short-term relationships, much higher in the borderline group compared to the control group. And so forth. So what we did not find in this small sample was a difference with regard to onset of puberty. So there was virtually no difference between the borderline patients and controls in this regard, so which is not in line with the evolutionary framework that I presented earlier. However, in a large sample of non-clinical girls, it was found that there's a huge difference actually with regard to sexual maturation when you compare girls who receive high parental versus low parental support. So this graph shows that there is actually almost a 3-year difference in sexual maturation between girls experiencing high versus low parental support. And this was depending on the genetic or perhaps epigenetic makeup, because a crucial factor was the reactivity of the autonomic nervous system. So this difference was only true for those individuals with a high reactivity of the autonomic nervous system. As you can see when you look at the dotted lines. Antenna stage refers to a questionnaire that explores the biological maturation. Another study by a German group found that, in line with the evolutionary perspective, that the tolerance of reward delay was reduced in patients with borderline personality disorder. So a classic experiment is referred to as delay discounting. So would you like to take 20 euros now or 100 in 2 months? So, and those patients with borderline personality disorder take the 20 now compared to controls who sometimes are better able to postpone this the receipt of the reward. In the last 2 or 3 years, we've started to explore the evolutionary perspective in greater detail in a new group of people with borderline personality disorder. Now we have collected 100 borderline patients